There is a silent problem that almost no one admits when talking about reading. You read pages and pages, skim through entire paragraphs, feel that you understood everything at that moment, and move on. But a few days later, when you try to remember what you read, most of it has simply disappeared. It's as if the information was never really there. Meanwhile, there are people who read quickly, absorb a lot, and can still explain clearly what they read weeks later. They don't seem to exert any apparent effort. They don't seem tired. And the strangest thing is that they don't spend hours reading. This creates an uncomfortable, almost unfair feeling. As if their brains were operating with some hidden advantage. Most people believe that reading well means reading slowly, underlining everything, and reviewing multiple times. But this method creates only familiarity, not retention. The brain recognizes the words, but it doesn't create strong enough connections to keep the information accessible. Reading a lot does not mean remembering a lot. In fact, it often means forgetting faster. Reading quickly and retaining at the same time seems illegal because it goes against everything that has been taught. But the truth is simple. The brain was not made to store information passively. It learns when it needs to work, when it needs to interpret, predict, and retrieve what it has just seen. Throughout this video, you will understand why most people forget almost everything they read. You will discover which habits sabotage your memory without you realizing it and what cognitive principle allows you to read at high speed without losing comprehension. If this type of content already catches your attention, take the opportunity to subscribe to the channel. Here, the focus is not on reading more books. It's about extracting more value from each page, using applied science and real cognitive control. Reading fast is not cheating. What has always been inefficient is the way they taught you to read. To understand why most people read a lot and retain so little, it is necessary to observe how reading has been taught from the beginning. Reading has always been treated as a passive activity. You sit down, follow the words with your eyes, and move on. The more pages, the better. The more time, the greater the sense of productivity. The problem is that the brain never learned well this way. The human brain was not designed to store information just because it passed before the eyes. When reading happens without cognitive effort, the mind enters an economic mode. The words make sense at that moment, but they are not marked as relevant for the future. The brain understands that it can be accessed again and, therefore, does not create strong connections. This creates the illusion of understanding. While you read, everything seems clear. The text seems simple. The ideas seem obvious. But this clarity is deceptive. It comes from recognition, not deep understanding. When the book closes or the article ends, most of the content begins to disappear quickly. Another factor that worsens everything is the modern reading context. Constant interruptions, notifications, fragmented reading. Each break in attention restarts the mental process. Even if you return to the text, the cognitive state necessary for retention has already been lost. The result is frustrating. Intelligent, dedicated people, reading constantly, but feeling that almost nothing sticks. Not due to a lack of ability, but because they are using a reading model that slows down memory without them realizing it. Before talking about reading faster, it is necessary to correct this. Because speeding up a wrong method only makes you forget faster. The real turning point happens when you understand a principle that almost no one teaches about reading and memory. The brain does not retain what is too easy to process. He retains what requires effort to retrieve. Whenever the reading is comfortable, linear, and predictable, the brain interprets it as something temporary. Something that doesn't need to take up valuable space in memory. That's why rereading, underlining, and marking beautiful sentences fail in retention. These methods keep the information always visible. The brain recognizes, agrees, and moves on. But recognizing is not learning. Recognizing is just realizing that something has been seen before. Learning is being able to access that information without external help. When you read too quickly without mental engagement, or too slowly without cognitive challenge, the result is the same. Low retention. What changes everything is when you force your brain to work during reading. Predict what comes next. Ask mentally what that means. Try to explain the idea in your own words right after the passage. This small cognitive discomfort is exactly what accelerates memory. Even when you make a mistake or get stuck, the brain receives a clear signal that the information matters. It adjusts, creates stronger connections, and increases the chance of remembering in the future. Another central point is the rhythm. The brain learns better in short and intense cycles, not in long and continuous readings. When you respect this pace, reading stops being tiring and becomes strategic. It is this principle that makes reading and retaining information quickly seem illegal. Not because you are circumventing something, but because you are using the mind the way it actually works. The first practical mechanism that transforms this principle into fast reading with real retention begins even before you move through the paragraphs. It requires a change in mental posture. Instead of opening a text to see what it says, you start opening the text with a clear intention. The brain needs a reason to pay attention. Without it, it conserves energy and lets the information pass by. Before you start reading, you set a simple question. What is this text trying to teach me? What is the central idea here? This question activates the attention system and prepares the mind to seek meaning, not just words. Reading ceases to be passive and becomes directed. During reading, the focus is not on memorizing sentences or following every detail. The focus is to understand the structure of the idea. What is being defended? Why this is important? How this concept connects with what came before. When you read this way, your brain creates natural mental maps instead of accumulating loose information. At the end of a short passage, you pause, close the text, and try to explain mentally what you just read, as if you were teaching someone else. That moment is crucial. It forces active recovery and quickly reveals whether there was real understanding or just superficial recognition. This process may seem slower at first, but it is exactly the opposite. In a few minutes, you consolidate ideas that would normally require several rereadings. This is where reading starts to seem unfair to those who still skim through. After you start reading actively, a new challenge arises. How to maintain retention without losing speed. It is at this point that many people go wrong. They think that reading fast simply means speeding up their eyes. But speed without cognitive control only accelerates forgetting. The brain does not work well with a continuous flow of information. It works in cycles. When you exceed the natural limit of focus, the quality of reading declines, even if the speed increases. That's why readers who retain well know exactly when to stop. They don't read until they're tired. They stop before. The strategy here is simple. Read in short and complete blocks. One topic, one central idea, a few pages at most. At the end of each block, you intentionally pause the reading. Not to check your phone, not to get distracted, but to let your brain organize what it has just received. These short pauses are what transform reading into memory. It is in this interval that the brain connects ideas, eliminates excess, and strengthens what matters. Without a pause, there is no consolidation. Just accumulation. There is also an important psychological effect. When you finish reading with a sense of clarity, the brain releases dopamine. This creates natural engagement. Reading stops being tiring and becomes stimulating. You don't force the habit. It sustains itself. If you've ever felt that you can read a lot but quickly forget the content, comment down below. I want to know if this is a problem you experience today or if you have already noticed some improvement by changing your reading method. In the next step, we will talk about the most common mistake that destroys retention, even in disciplined readers. There is a silent error that destroys retention even in disciplined and eager-to-learn people. This mistake happens when you continue reading even after realizing that your mind has already started to wander. The eyes follow the lines, the pages keep turning, but the brain is no longer really present. At this point, reading more doesn't help. It only reinforces forgetting. The brain learns better in a specific state. A calm state of alertness, with a slight cognitive challenge. When this state is lost, reading becomes noise. Insisting beyond this limit creates a negative effect. The mind associates reading with fatigue, not with clarity. Over time, this generates internal resistance and a decline in interest. Readers who retain very well understand something counterintuitive. Stopping at the right moment is part of the method. Ending the reading when there is still energy creates a feeling of incompleteness. This small tension keeps the content active in the mind even after the book is closed. The brain continues organizing ideas, connecting concepts, and strengthening memory in the background. But when you push yourself to exhaustion, everything gets mixed up. Ideas lose shape, details get confused, and retention plummets. The extra effort doesn't turn into extra learning. This change in attitude transforms reading. You stop measuring progress in pages read and start measuring it in real understanding. Less time, more results. Less wear and tear, more control. It is at this point that reading quickly and retaining information starts to seem unfair. Not because you are doing something wrong, but because you are respecting the brain's real pace. There are some deeply rooted myths and habits that prevent people from reading quickly and truly retaining information, even when they are already trying hard to improve. One of the biggest is believing that marking everything is a sign of good reading. When you underline almost every sentence, the brain doesn't know what is important. Everything becomes a priority and, in the end, nothing stands out. Instead of helping, this dilutes memory. Another common mistake is believing that deep reading requires extreme slowness. Many people slow down so much that they turn reading into something heavy and boring. The brain loses engagement, attention drops, and retention suffers. Depth does not come from slowness, it comes from the active processing of ideas. There is also the belief that rereading solves everything. Rereading can provide comfort, but it rarely generates new learning. The brain recognizes the text and creates a sense of mastery, even when the information is not yet independently accessible. That's why so many people feel confident while reading and insecure afterward. Ignoring your mental state is another silent saboteur. Reading when tired, hungry, or surrounded by stimuli drastically reduces retention capacity. It's not a lack of discipline, it's biology. If any of these mistakes seem familiar to you, give the video a like. This helps this content reach more people who also want to read better and remember more, but are still stuck with methods that don't work. In the next step, we will show why this method is validated in practice and works even in high-demand environments. When you observe people who really read quickly and retain a lot, you realize that these principles are not theory. They are used in contexts where forgetting is not an option. Researchers, professionals dealing with large volumes of information, high-performing students, and efficient self-learners no longer read pages. They extract more meaning per page. Studies in cognitive psychology show that retention improves drastically when reading requires active retrieval and constant interpretation. It is not the time of exposure that strengthens memory, but the correct mental effort. That's why high-performance environments avoid passive reading. The focus is always on understanding and application. This also explains why some people can master complex subjects in a short time. They don't try to remember every sentence. They understand the central principles and how the ideas connect. The brain prefers structures to isolated details. When this structure is clear, the details fit together much more easily. Even outside of formal study, this pattern repeats itself. Everything you can really explain well was not learned through passive repetition, but through active use. Reading works the same way. When you read with intention, pause, and explain, the brain treats it as useful knowledge. That's why this method seems illegal to those who still read the traditional way. While many measure progress in pages, those who apply these principles measure it in real comprehension. Putting all of this into daily practice doesn't require any complex routines or special tools. What makes the difference is the way you organize your reading. The first step is to stop reading without a plan. Each reading session needs to have a clear objective. Not reading an entire book, not moving through chapters, but extracting a specific idea that makes sense to you. In practice, this means opening the text already knowing what you want to understand. Read a short passage, with full attention, and then stop. At that moment, you ask yourself what really remained. What was the central idea? How does this connect with something you already knew? This small effort activates long-term memory. After that, you move on to the next section. No rush, no piling up pages. A few well-processed pages are worth much more than dozens read on autopilot. Throughout the day, you can repeat this process in short sessions. 10 or 15 minutes well spent generate more retention than a scattered hour. Over time, something changes. You start to trust your own memory. You realize that you can explain what you read without looking. That the ideas remain days later. Reading ceases to be something fragile and becomes solid. This method does not depend on motivation. It is sustained by the result. When you realize that you remember more with less effort, reading becomes something you control, not something that controls you. In the end, reading quickly and retaining information is not about extreme speed or competing with others. It's about mental control. It's understanding that the brain was not made to absorb information passively, but to work with meaning. When you change the way you read, you also change the way you think. Reading stops being something that flows through the mind and becomes something that settles, connects, and remains. You realize that you don't need to read more books to learn more. You need to extract more from each page. When reading becomes active, strategic, and respects the brain's rhythm, learning becomes lighter. Less wasted effort, more clarity. Less forgetting, more real mastery of the content. If this video helped you see reading in a different way, subscribe to the channel. Here, the focus is on using applied science to learn better, think more clearly, and develop cognitive advantage in the real world. The most important thing is to remember this. You don't have a memory problem. You never did. What was always missing was a method that aligned with the way the brain learns. Now that you understand this, reading stops being an obstacle and becomes a powerful tool. When you can read quickly, retain deeply, and explain clearly, learning stops being exhausting and becomes liberating. And this skill, when well used, not only changes the way you study but also the way you see your own potential.